Arquette. I'm the chair of the Communication Department of the Faculty Senate here at Aurora University. I have the distinct pleasure of introducing tonight's guest speaker as part of the Arts and Ideas series, Dr. Martha Nussbaum, a Distinguished Service Professor of Law and Ethics and for the Law School and Philosophy Department at the University of Chicago. Dr. Nussbaum has been writing extensively about issues of the humanities in higher education, as well as capabilities and the role they play in development around the world. She's an internationally renowned scholar, but before coming to the University of Chicago, Dr. Nussbaum received her MA and PhD from Harvard University, having taught also at Harvard, Brown, and Oxford University. Dr. Nussbaum has honorary degrees from over 50 colleges and universities across the US, Canada, Latin America, Asia, Africa, including the University of Athens, the University of Edinburgh, the University of Toronto, Emory University, and Georgetown. She's a recipient of the Grandmeyer Award in Education in 2002, the Ratcliffe Alumni Recognition Award in 2007, the Centennial Medal of the Graduate School of Arts and Sciences at Harvard University, as well as having received the Ask Award from the German Social Science Research Council for her contributions on social system reform. Her publications are long, but among the most highlights for tonight that are most relevant are her works involving the fragility of goodness, cultivating humanity, women in development, frontiers of justice, creating capabilities of the human development approach, political emotions, why love matters for justice, and specifically tonight's text, Not-for-Profit, Why Democracy Needs the Humanities. And with that, with no further ado, I'd like to introduce tonight's guest speaker, Dr. Martha Nussbaum.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be here and to talk with you about the problems in higher education today. I want to start, though, with a long ago quotation. It's from an Indian author. He was the first Indian to win the Nobel Prize, Rabindranath Tagore, who founded a school and a university in India. And in 1917, he said something about education that I think is coming true today, unfortunately. History has come to a stage when the moral man, the complete man, is more and more giving way, almost without knowing it, to make room for the commercial man, the man of limited purpose. This process, aided by the wonderful progress in science, is assuming gigantic proportion and power, causing the upset of man's moral balance, obscuring his human side under the shadow of soulless organization. Well, we're in the middle of a crisis of massive proportions and grave global consequences. And I'm not talking about the global economic crisis that began in 2008 and that's still continuing. At least then, everyone knew that a crisis was at hand, and world leaders worked quickly and desperately to find solutions. They knew that their jobs were on the line if they did not find solutions. No, I mean a crisis that's gone largely unnoticed, a crisis that is likely to be, in the long run, far more damaging to the future of democratic self-governance and global welfare. That is a worldwide crisis in education. Radical changes are occurring in what democratic societies teach young people, and these changes have not been well thought through. Eager for national profit, nations and their systems of education are heedlessly discarding skills that are needed to keep democracy alive. If this trend continues, nations all over the world will soon be producing generations of useful machines rather than complete citizens who can think for themselves, criticize tradition, and understand the significance of another human being's sufferings and achievements. Now, what am I talking about? Of course, about the fact that the humanities and the arts are being cut away in both primary and secondary and in college university education in virtually every nation in the world. Seen by policymakers as useless frills at a time when nations must cut away all useless things in order to stay competitive in the global market, they're rapidly losing their place in curricula and also in the minds and hearts of parents and young people. Indeed, what we might call the humanistic aspects of science and social science, that is, the imaginative, creative aspects, the aspect of rigorous critical thinking, are also losing ground as nations prefer to pursue short-term profit by the cultivation of highly applied, useful skills suited to turning a short-term profit. This crisis is facing us, but we haven't yet faced it. Consider these two examples. Well, one is 7 years old and one very recent, but both illustrate the alarming trend that is sweeping our country. And although they're both American examples, I find, and I've lectured in many other nations about this, and my book by now has been translated into 20 languages, so it kind of shows you that this is something people have on their minds and view as a problem. Okay, so in the fall of 2006, the U.S. Department of Education's Commission on the Future of Higher Education, headed by Bush administration's Secretary of Education, Margaret Spellings, released a report on the state of higher education in the nation that was called A Test of Leadership, Charting the Future of U.S. Higher Education. Now, this report does contain a valuable critique of unequal access to higher education, and I think it should be applauded for that. But when it came to subject matter, it focused entirely on education for national economic gain, with perceived deficiencies in applied science, technology, and engineering. Not even basic scientific research, but only highly applied learning. Learning, as I say, that can quickly generate profit-making strategies. The humanities, the arts, and critical thinking were just absent. And by omitting them, the report strongly suggested that it would be perfectly all right if the future did not contain those, and they were allowed to wither away. Okay, second example, in one of his first acts as governor of North Carolina, Governor Pat McCrory lashed out at liberal arts education. He said university curricula are full of what he called worthless courses that, quote, offer no chances of getting people jobs, end quote. And he singled out language study, philosophy, and gender studies as examples of the useless. He said, I'm going to adjust my education curriculum to what business and commerce needs to get our kids jobs. Now, it's not clear he has the power to enact those ideas because, of course, he doesn't set the curriculum for the university system. But it's ominous that he thinks he can gain popularity by beating up on the humanities. Not to belabor the obvious, there are hundreds of stories like this, and new ones come in every day from the US, from Asia, and Europe, and so on. Given that economic growth is so eagerly sought by all nations, too few questions have been posed in both developed and developing nations about the direction of education, and with it, of democratic society. The profit motive suggests to concerned politicians that science and technology are of crucial importance for the future health of their nations. Now, we shouldn't object, I think, to good scientific and technical education, and I don't suggest that nations should stop trying to improve in that regard. My concern is that other abilities, equally crucial, are at risk of getting lost in the competitive frenzy, abilities crucial to the health of any democracy internally and to the creation of a decent world culture and a robust type of global citizenship capable of constructively addressing the world's most pressing problems. These abilities are associated with the humanities and the arts, the ability to think critically, the ability to transcend local loyalties and to approach world problems as a citizen of the world, and the ability to imagine sympathetically the predicament of a person different from oneself. But to think about education for democracy, we have to think about what a democratic nation is and what democratic nations strive for. So what does it mean, then, for a nation to advance, to increase its quality of life? On one view, it means simply to increase its gross domestic product per capita. That measure of national achievement has been used for many years by development economists around the world as if it were a good proxy for a nation's overall quality of life. So the goal of a nation, says this model, should be economic growth. Never mind about distribution and social equality, never mind about the preconditions of democratic stability, such as health and education, never mind about the quality of race and gender relations, never mind about the improvement of other aspects of a human being's quality of life. One sign of what this model leaves out is the fact that South Africa, under apartheid, used to shoot to the top of the development tables when you use that paradigm, because there was a lot of stuff around in the old South Africa. And the old model of development rewarded that amount of stuff without asking what it was doing for people. So ignoring the staggering distributional inequalities, the brutal apartheid regime, and the health and educational deficiencies that went with it. This model of development has by now been rejected by many serious development thinkers, and I've been involved in that movement in my own academic work. Proponents of the old model sometimes like to claim that if you get economic growth, somehow that will trickle down and produce all the other good things that I'm talking about. But by now, examining the way things have gone around the world, we've discovered that that is actually not true. Economic growth does not deliver political liberty and religious liberty. We can all see that from the stunning economic success of China. Nor does promoting economic growth always promote even other material things, such as healthcare or education. There are lots of comparative studies, for example, of different Indian states where it's clear that growth is not highly correlated with achievements in health and education. Now, what sort of education does that old model of development suggest? Education for economic growth needs basic skills, literacy, numeracy. It also needs some people to have more advanced skills in computer science and engineering. But equal access is not terribly important. A nation can generate growth while the rural poor remain illiterate and without basic resources. And the results of growth created by foreign investment usually don't trickle down at all to improve the health and well-being of the people in a given region. So that's always the most basic problem with the GDP per capita paradigm of development. It neglects distribution, and it gives high marks to nations or regions that contain alarming inequalities. After that, education for economic growth needs perhaps a rudimentary familiarity with history and with economic fact on the part of the people who are going to get beyond elementary education in the first place, who are likely, as I said, to be a rather small elite. But care must be taken, lest the historical and economic narrative lead to serious critical thinking about class, about whether foreign investment is really good for the rural poor, about whether democracy can even survive when such huge inequalities in basic life chances obtain. So critical thinking would not be a very important part of education for economic growth, and it has not been in states that have pursued this goal relentlessly, such as, we could talk about Singapore, we could talk about certain states within India that have pursued the growth agenda, including Prime Minister Modi's home state of Gujarat, and there are many other cases. So I've spoken about critical thinking and about the role of history, but what about the arts, so often valued by progressive democratic educators? An education for economic growth will probably have contempt for those aspects of the child's training because it doesn't look like they lead directly to economic growth. But there's more. They'll do more than ignore the arts. Educators for economic growth may well fear the arts, for a cultivated and developed sympathy is a particularly dangerous enemy of obtuseness, and ethical obtuseness is necessary to carry out programs of economic growth that simply ignore inequality. Speaking of education in both India and the West, Rabindranath Tagore said that aggressive nationalism needs to blunt the moral conscience. So it needs people who don't really see the individual, who speak group speak, who behave and think like docile bureaucrats. And of course, the arts are typically the great enemy of that kind of obtuseness. Artists are never the reliable servants of any ideology, even a basically good one. They always ask the imagination to move beyond its usual confines and to see the world in new ways. So, Tagore's school and his university were grounded in the arts, and they were radical and deeply challenging to the status quo, and his agenda is deeply unpopular and radical today, with politicians aiming at national economic growth. So, educators for economic growth will campaign against the humanities and the arts as ingredients of basic education, and of course this assault is currently taking place all over the world. How else might we think of the sort of nation and the sort of citizen we're trying to build? The primary alternative to the growth-based model of national success in development circles, and the one that I've been involved with for many years, is known as the capabilities approach, or sometimes it's also called the human development approach. According to this model, what's important is what governments do for people, what opportunities, or we call them capabilities, each person has in key areas ranging from health, life, and bodily integrity to political liberty, political participation, and education. So this model of development recognizes that each person has an inalienable human dignity that ought to be respected by laws and institutions. A decent nation, at a bare minimum, acknowledges that its citizens all have entitlements in these and other areas and devises strategies that get people above a basic level of opportunity in each. And this ideal is reflected in the education agendas of many countries that have put an education right into their constitutions. But if a nation wants to promote that type of humane, people-sensitive democracy, one dedicated to promoting what Thomas Jefferson called opportunities for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to each and every person, what abilities will it need to produce in its citizens? At least the following three seem crucial. First, the ability to deliberate well about political issues affecting the nation, to reflect, to examine, to argue, to debate, deferring neither to tradition nor to authority. Second, the ability to think about the good of one's nation as a complicated whole, not just the good of one's own local group, and to see one's own nation in turn as part of a complicated, interlocking world where problems of many kinds need intelligent, transnational deliberation for their solution. And third, the ability to have concern for the lives of others, to imagine what policies of many types that one might vote for mean for the opportunities and experiences of one's fellow citizens of many different types, and also people outside one's own nation. But before we can say more about what that means for education, we need to understand the problems we face on the way to making young people responsible, democratic citizens who might possibly implement a human development agenda. So what is it about human life that makes it so hard to sustain democratic institutions and so easy to lapse into hierarchies of various types, or even worse, projects of violent group animosity? Whatever these forces are, it's ultimately against those that true education for human development must fight. And so it must, as I would put it, following Gandhi, fight the clash, engage with the clash of civilizations inside each person, as respect for other people contends against narcissistic aggression. This internal clash is found in all societies in different forms, since all contain struggles over inclusion and equality, whether the precise locus of the struggles is in debates about immigration or the accommodation of religious, racial, and ethnic minorities, or gender equality or affirmative action, and so on and so on. In all societies, too, there are forces in the human personality that militate against mutual recognition and reciprocity. And there are also forces of compassion and respect that give democracy strong support. So, okay, what do we know by now about the forces in the personality that militate against democratic reciprocity and respect? First, we know that people have a very high level of deference to authority. Psychologist Stanley Milgram and some famous experiments showed that experimental subjects were willing to give what they believed to be a dangerous and painful level of electric shock to another person, who, of course, it was all faked for the sake of the experiment, who was writhing and groaning in pain, when the superintending scientist said things like, "You must go ahead, you ought to do it," and so on. And that was shocking, because the person was screaming in pain. We also know that people have an alarmingly high level of deference to peer pressure. Another psychologist called Solomon Asch, much earlier, showed that experimental subjects were willing to give false answers to very clear visual questions when people before them, who were hired by Asch, gave the wrong answer. So, for example, they'd have two lines, A and B, and the question would be, is line A parallel to line B, where it was not difficult to tell what the answer was. And if at least 6 people before the experimental subject gave the wrong answer, almost inevitably, the experimental subject also gave the wrong answer. Now, sometimes they said, well, I thought it was A and B were parallel, but I don't know. Other people thought the opposite, and so who am I to judge? And so, sometimes, even more shockingly, they said, well, I knew that it wasn't parallel, but I was ashamed in front of the other people to say what I really thought. So all of that stuff is alarming. Both Milgram's work and Asch's have been used effectively by historian Christopher Browning to explain the behavior of a police battalion in World War II, young Germans who shot Jews at point-blank range. So great was the influence of both authority and peer pressure on these young men that in diaries and letters, they agonizingly admitted shame at their weakness if they hadn't been able to shoot the Jews. Still, other research demonstrates that apparently normal people are willing to engage in behavior that humiliates and stigmatizes if their situation is set up in a certain way, casting them in a dominant role and telling them that others are their inferiors. You've probably all heard by now, because of the movie, about Phil Zimbardo's Stanford prison experiment, where there were these subjects assigned randomly to the position of prison guard and prisoner, and almost immediately they started behaving in a way that abused the authority of the guards. So that's not a perfect experiment. There were a number of flaws in it, but that kind of thing has been reproduced in many different cases. Other research on disgust, on which I've drawn in writing a book about the role of disgust in social inequality, shows that most of us are very uncomfortable with the signs of our own animality and mortality. Disgust is the emotion that polices the boundary between us and the other animals. In virtually all societies, it's not enough to keep ourselves free from putative contamination by bodily waste products that are, in the language of the psychologists, animal reminders. Instead, people create subordinate groups of human beings who are identified as quasi-animal, disgusting, smelly, contaminating, bearers of disease, and so on. And there's been a lot of work done by now on how such attitudes figure in the history of anti-Semitism, in racism in the US, caste hierarchy in India, in sexism, in homophobia. And I've been telling faculty at dinner that I'm part of a big project that joins Americans with Indian scholars to do further comparative research on these phenomena. Well, what else do we know? We know that these forces take on much more power when people are anonymous or are not held personally accountable. People act much worse under the shelter of anonymity as parts of a faceless mass than they do when they're watched and made accountable as individuals. The notorious rise of bullying on the internet, where people can usually remain anonymous, is just one example of that pernicious dynamic. Second, people behave worse when no one raises a critical voice. Ash's subjects went along with the false judgment when all the other people, and as I say, there usually had to be 6, whom they took to be fellow experimental subjects and who were really working for Ash, said the wrong thing. But if even one of the 6 spoke up and said the right thing, Ash found that that freed up the experimental subject to say what he or she really thought. Third, people behave much worse when the human beings over whom they have power are dehumanized and de-individualized. In a wide range of situations, people behave much worse when the so-called other is portrayed as just an animal or as bearing a number and not a name. So in thinking how we might help individuals and societies to win this internal clash of civilizations, we would do well to think how these tendencies could be used to our advantage. The other side of the internal clash, and this part I think has been very well understood by some of our greatest modern leaders, including Gandhi, but also including Martin Luther King Jr. and Nelson Mandela, is each person's growing capacity for compassionate concern, for seeing another person as an end and not a mere means. One of the easiest ways to try to regain lost omnipotence is to make slaves of others, and of course that's all too common in the world. But as time goes on, as a child develops, children do learn to see the other people in their world as full and real human beings, if all goes well, and to respect their independent right to have a life. As concern develops, it leads also to an increasing wish to control one's own aggression. The child recognizes that its parents are not its slaves, but separate beings. Such recognitions are typically unstable, since human life is a chancy business, and we all feel anxieties that lead us to want more control, including control over other people. But a good development in the family and a good education later on can make a child feel genuine compassion for the needs of others and can lead it to see them as people with rights equal to its own. So, now that we have a little sense of the terrain on which education goes to work, let me come back to the ideas I mentioned earlier, saying some things very sketchy still, but radical in the present world culture, concerning the abilities that a good education will cultivate. Now, as we consider curriculum, let's bear firmly in mind, since I'm going to focus now on higher education, the wonderful and virtually unique opportunity that our U.S. system of higher education offers us all. In most nations of the world, once you enter a university, you have to study one subject. So, either all philosophy or no philosophy, either all literature or no literature. And of course, that means that women's studies hardly exists, and then race study doesn't exist. You don't want to do all that because you would be identified as a marginal or a radical. So, our country, like South Korea and Scotland, and partly Canada, South Africa, and the Netherlands, thinks differently. Students should have a major subject, which might or might not, but often does prepare them for a career. But they should also take some courses that prepare them more broadly for citizenship and life. I think we're very lucky to have this structure, which permits students to, let's say, major in computer science or engineering, but also to take general liberal arts courses in history, philosophy, and literature. So what I'm talking about now is why we should keep this structure and strengthen it, rather than going over to a system that's much narrower and that virtually guarantees that the humanities will be marginal. So 3 values, I would argue, are particularly central to decent global citizenship. The first is the capacity for Socratic self-examination, critical thought about one's own traditions. As Socrates argued, democracy is basically good form, but it's kind of sleepy and sluggish, and it needs citizens who can think for themselves rather than just deferring to authority or tradition, who can reason together about their choices rather than simply trading boasts and claims. He said he was like a gadfly on the back of the democracy, which he described as a noble but sluggish horse. That is, he was stinging it to wake it up so it could do its own business more effectively. Critical thinking is particularly crucial for good citizenship in any society, and I really think that's every modern society, that needs to come to grips with the presence of people who differ by ethnicity, caste, race, religion, sexuality, and so on. We'll only have a chance at an adequate dialogue across cultural boundaries if young citizens know how to engage in dialogue and deliberation in the first place. And they will only know how to do that if they learn how to examine themselves and to think about the reasons why they're inclined to support one thing rather than another, rather than, as so often happens, seeing political discussion as just a way of insulting somebody or trading boasts or winning a victory for your sports team and so on. So when politicians bring simplistic propaganda their way, as politicians in every country have a way of doing, young people will only have a hope of preserving independence and holding the politicians accountable if they know how to think critically about what they hear, testing its logic and imagining alternatives to it. Students exposed to instruction in critical thinking also learn a new attitude to people who disagree with them. They learn to see people who disagree not as an opposing sports team to be defeated, maybe even humiliated, but instead as people who have reasons for what they think, and when their arguments are reconstructed, it may turn out that they even share some important premises with one's own side, and we will both understand better where the differences come from. So you can see how this humanizes the political other, making the mind see that opposing form as a rational being who may share at least some thoughts with one's own group. There was a student I once interviewed for my first book on education who said that it was, so he was in a philosophy class that he had to take, and he was a business major, and he was assigned to argue against the death penalty, although he actually supports it. And he said it really blew his mind because he didn't know before that. He had never had the idea that you could produce arguments for a position that you do not yourself believe. Now imagine, this is a very smart 19-year-old. He had not gotten that idea from our American culture. And he said that it really transformed his thinking about political debate. He's much more inclined to be curious, to try to figure out where the differences come from, and to seek some common ground, and so on. Now, the idea that one will take responsibility for one's own reasoning and exchange ideas with others in an atmosphere of mutual respect is essential to the peaceful resolution of differences, both within a nation and in a world increasingly polarized by ethnic and religious conflict. It's possible, and I think very important, to encourage that kind of thing from the very beginning of a child's education, and in fact, it's often been done. It's one of the hallmarks of progressive education, from Froebel and Pestalozzi in Germany, Maria Montessori in Italy, Rabindranath Tagore in India, to Bronson Alcott in 19th century America, and then, of course, John Dewey in my own Chicago. But still, critical thinking needs to be defended because it's fragile. It's a discipline that can be taught as part of a school's curriculum, but it won't be well taught unless it informs the entire spirit of a school's pedagogy. I mean, if you go from your philosophy class where you learn critical thinking into, let's say, history class where a whole bunch of facts are rained down upon you and you're never asked to think critically, that's not going to be as effective as if it pervades the whole spirit of pedagogy. So let's think a little about the relevance of this ability to the current state of modern democracy surrounded by a powerful global marketplace. Now, first of all, we should emphasize that even if we were just aiming at economic growth, leading members of our business culture understand very well the importance of creating corporate cultures in which critical voices are not silenced, cultures of individuality and accountability. David Rubenstein, who's co-founder of the Carlyle Group, one of our most successful private equity firms, said at the World Economic Forum in Davos a little while ago that he's worried that American students are losing this valuable skill that can help them succeed in business and life, namely critical thinking. American policymakers and educators, Rubenstein says, have put too much of a focus on the so-called STEM disciplines, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, at the expense of the study of literature, philosophy, and the humanities. Humanities, he says, teach problem-solving skills that enable students to actually do well in a corporate culture because it keeps corporate cultures accountable. Career-specific skills, he says, you can always learn that later. But, and he notes that many of Wall Street's top executives study the humanities, the reasoning skills that come with a well-rounded humanities education are much more fundamental. So, anyway, he says he makes a business-oriented case for the humanities. So that's one kind of case we can make. And we should add that our rivals in the world of economic growth have long heeded Rubenstein's advice. Both China and Singapore have recently conducted education reforms to add a lot more critical thinking, as well as literature and art, which I'll get to later, to the basic curriculum, and they are not doing that for the sake of democratic citizenship. In fact, they have trouble because in Singapore you have to learn critical thinking, but you're not allowed to criticize the government. And in fact, you can be, instructors can be sued for libel if they criticize the government in their class, so that has quite a chilling effect, believe me. But anyway, so our goal, as I've said, is not simply economic growth. So let me now turn to political culture. As I've said, human beings are prone to be subservient to both authority and peer pressure. To prevent things from going to the bad, we need to counteract these tendencies, producing a culture of individual dissent. Ash, as I say, found that when even one dissenter was in the group that he had set up, others followed, so that one critical voice can have large consequences. By emphasizing each person's active voice, we also promote a culture of accountability. When people see their ideas as their own, they're more likely, too, to see their deeds as their own responsibility. So now the second prong. The second key ability of the modern democratic citizen, I would argue, is the ability to see oneself as a member of a complicated nation and world, understanding something of the history and character of the diverse groups that inhabit this. And so this is also a crucial plank in your own set of core courses here. And I've just been extremely excited to hear how the teaching in that one goes. Knowledge is no guarantee of good behavior, but ignorance is a virtual guarantee of bad behavior. Simple cultural and religious stereotypes abound in our world. For example, the facile assimilation of Muslims to terrorists. And the first way to begin combating these is to make sure that students learn a much more complicated relation to the world. And they're not going to be able to learn about every region of the world, but they learn how to learn and what questions to ask. They should gradually come to understand both differences that make understanding difficult and shared human needs and interests that make understanding essential if common problems are to be solved. Now, as I've already suggested, this understanding of the world will promote human development only if it is itself infused by searching critical thinking. History would not be taught as a list of facts, but as a set of problems of assessing evidence, constructing a convincing narrative, understanding how past narratives are influenced by political bias, and so on. Students should learn how to assess critically the narratives they hear and to identify sources of incompleteness and bias. In curricular terms, these ideas suggest, I think, that all undergraduates should learn the rudiments of world history, taught with a methodological sophistication not possible before college, and should also get a rich and non-stereotypical understanding of the major world religions. And then they should all get encouraged to inquire in greater depth into at least one unfamiliar tradition, in this way acquiring tools that can later be used elsewhere. At the same time, they need to learn about the major traditions, majority and minority, within their own nation, focusing on understanding how differences of religion, race, gender, and so on have been associated with differential life opportunities. And then I think that all should learn at least one foreign language well, seeing how another group of intelligent human beings has carved up the world in subtly different ways, how all translation is therefore stammering interpretation, that gives a young person an essential lesson in cultural humility. The third ability of the citizen, closely related to the first two, is what I would call the narrative imagination. This means the ability to think what it might be like to be in the shoes of a person different from oneself, to be an intelligent reader of that person's story, and to try to come to grips with the emotions and wishes and desires that someone so placed might have. The cultivation of sympathy has been a key part of the best modern ideas of progressive education, and as I've observed, the moral imagination, always under siege from fear and narcissism, is apt to be obtuse, if not energetically refined and cultivated through the rigorous development of sympathy and concern, learning to see another being not as a mere thing, but as a full person, is not an automatic achievement. It looks like we're all born with the ability to be what psychologist Paul Bloom calls mind readers, that is, to occupy different perspectives, and only a few other animals are able to do that, elephants, dolphins, in some cases dogs. But we have that from birth, but we usually use it very narrowly. We think about our own group. And so we have to aggressively promote understanding by an education that refines the ability to think what the inner life of another might be, and also to understand why one can never fully grasp that inner world, why any person is always to a certain extent dark to any other. As Proust says, a person imposes a dead weight that the imagination can never completely remove. And that is clearly true of the self, to the self, as well as other people. Now, the arts can cultivate student sympathy in many ways, through engagement with many different works of literature, music, fine art, dance. But thought needs to be given to what the student's particular blind spots are likely to be, and text should be chosen in consequence. For all societies at all times have their particular blind spots, groups within the culture and also groups abroad that are especially likely to be dealt with ignorantly and obtusely. Works of art can be chosen to promote criticism of this obtuseness and a more adequate vision of the unseen. Novelist Ralph Ellison, in a later essay about his great novel Invisible Man, wrote that a novel like his could be, quote, a raft of perception, entertainment, and hope, on which American culture could negotiate the snags and whirlpools that stand between us and our democratic ideal, end quote. Now, that metaphor of the raft is a very rich one, because it alludes to that raft on which Huck Finn and Jim went down the Mississippi together, learning to see how America looks, each of them, through the other person's eyes. Ellison's novel, of course, takes the so-called inner eyes of the white reader as its theme and its target. Its hero announces in the first sentence, "I am an invisible man," and then he goes on to say, well, that invisibility is not caused by a chemical accident to my epidermis, but rather by a certain deficiency in the inner eyes of the people with whom I come in contact. And as we go through the novel, of course, we see that all the other characters, both black and white actually, project wishes, hopes, fantasies onto him, and he's just a blank screen for their narcissistic projections, and no one really sees him. So the idea that Ellison later expressed is that through the imagination, we are able to have a kind of insight into the experience of another group or person that's very difficult to attain in daily life, particularly when our world has constructed sharp separations between groups and suspicions that make any encounter difficult. So we know, as I said, that young children are mind readers, but of course we also know, and this is something that Bloom's research also shows, that human beings are clannish and narrow, and that they have a tendency to kind of group together, and therefore we need culture. And Bloom says, well, now this is what I've shown you by experiments, all the rest is culture. And there is impressive evidence by now that reading complicated fictions activates areas of the mind that usually don't become active in routine daily interactions. And that people who have the fiction habit, and interestingly, they find that it can't just be pulp fiction, it has to be something. Chekhov is the thing they often use to test, to do these experiments. So people who have the fiction habit are more responsive interlocutors in many social situations. Moreover, the elegant work of psychologist Dan Batson shows that the vivid imagining of another person's predicament is strongly correlated with behavioral changes, with actually helping another person, other things held constant. So we have many reasons to promote empathetic awareness through the arts. So now let's just try to take stock. How are the abilities of citizenship doing in our world today? Not too well, I fear. Education of the type I recommend is still hanging in there in the place where I first studied it, namely the liberal arts portion of U.S. colleges and universities. And that's what you're doing here, so it's great to see. So it's this part of the curriculum in institutions like my own that actually particularly attract philanthropic support. So now I'm going to go back to an economic argument. As rich people, and I find this, they remember with pleasure how they used to have joy reading Plato, and maybe they fell in love reading a novel and so on. And they pursued issues that they loved, and they did it in a non-instrumental way. And then, so that does tend to make them friends of donation to the humanities. But now there's great strain. In the New York Times, Harvard's President Drew Faust reports that the economic downturn has reinforced a picture that the real value of a university degree is largely instrumental, and that university leaders are increasingly pressured to embrace a market model of their mission, and in consequence to cut back on the liberal arts. Outside the US, many nations whose university curricula don't have that liberal arts structure are trying to build one because they see its importance in crafting a public response to problems of pluralism, fear, and suspicion that their societies face. IITs, the Institutes of Technology and Management in India, are putting in rapidly humanities courses because they think that there's so much caste discrimination and discrimination against Muslims, and better do something about it. Well, in a way, after not having any such education all through high school, then they suddenly have one course. It's not going to be that effective. So whether reforms will really occur that will be effective is hard to say. Liberal education is complicated. It requires thought. It requires a structured curriculum, and it has certain pedagogical demands. Teaching of the sort that I recommend needs small classes, or at least small sections within larger classes where students are going to get copious feedback on frequent writing assignments. European institutions, unfortunately, they cultivate the idea that when you become a professor, you don't have to teach. So then, when you try to create the liberal arts career, you might get a lecture course with 500 people and a multiple choice exam. That happens in Norway, for example. And it's really just a disgrace. But then when other people who have a better sense of what's required try to get the government to pay for enough posts to give the real small classes, that doesn't work so well either. So, and meanwhile, in many nations, politicians are imposing increasing demands for so-called relevance to national economic goals before they'll fund departments, programs, and even the research of individual scholars. Britain has faced these demands since the Thatcher era, but they've recently become a lot sharper. And now every single scholar, whether they're a philosopher, logician, whatever, they have to show that their research has immediate payoff in terms of economic growth, impact it's called. Now, our system of university education has 5 features that make it very different from universities in Europe and most of Asia, South Korea being an exception. And first is what I've already said, the longstanding tradition of liberal arts education. Now, this system has inertia built into it, so if people want to retain it, they have an easier job than the people in Europe who are trying to start it. And I think it also gives people a way of answering the objections of parents by not forcing anyone to make the difficult choice between studies that seem to prepare for a job and studies that seem to prepare only for life in general. It's taken for granted that you do both. And note that the system has utterly rejected the idea that consumer demand is the criterion of what should be required of students. Although often students are members of curricular review committees, and they should be, it's simply understood that required courses are a valuable way of exposing students to something new that will benefit them in the long term, and they might be too timid or distracted or indifferent to select those on their own. Moreover, the system guarantees that the wealthy people of society have at one time studied literature, philosophy, and history. And so, of course, that's a feedback mechanism that ensures, or at least makes more likely, the continued funding of those things. I've been involved in fundraising things in Germany where it's hard because they never had this education in the first place. So how do you explain to a very wealthy woman in Frankfurt that she should support the humanities? Well, her banker, who really liked philosophy, had to tell her, if you don't have a cause like philosophy, your children will be fighting and they'll be squabbling for your money. So give it to philosophy and then you'll end the fighting with you. But if she had ever studied philosophy, she would know what fun it is. And so that would be easier. So then, and this leads me to the second point, we have a well-developed system of private funding of higher education. By now, a very large proportion of U.S. colleges and universities are privately funded, and that is also true in South Korea, the only other place the humanities are strong. Even state university systems have been in this business for a long time. The University of Michigan, for example, has long been de facto a private university. Now, this system has drawbacks because administrators have to work nonstop to get the money they need. But given the system of liberal education, it also has huge advantages because you have a fertile ground to till, and a smart university will also reach out to such people and cultivate them by seminars and special events. At dinner, I was talking about the Humanities Weekend in my own university, in which the most active humanities donors, who are called the Humanities Visiting Committee, organize large numbers of alumni, community members, parents, potential donors, to visit the campus for a series of mini courses with faculty, which they really love doing that. Just for a weekend, they can be students again. And I've also worked with the head of that committee, a wealthy practicing lawyer who has endowed a chair in British literature. And she also creates donor retreats. And she chose as the text for a recent one Tolstoy's story, The Death of Ivan Ilyich, and I said, well, why are Richard Stryer and me supposed to talk about Tolstoy? We're not scholars of Russian literature. He's a Shakespeare scholar, I'm a philosopher. And she said, no, we're going to do that. She said, I'll ask, you can invite a Slavic specialist too if you want. So we did that. But I saw, when we did it, the great genius of her proposal, because actually all the people in the donor retreat were like Ivan Illich, that is, wealthy bourgeois people afraid of death. And when they start thinking about the meaning of life and what they could possibly do with their money that might make it meaningful, right? It's a natural setup for the next act, which is like you could give your money to the University of Chicago. So, but it is certainly a good system in that way. But it's important to see that donors of this sort have very different incentives from politicians. And I think that's one reason why so many public universities have gotten fed up with the politicians and have gone eagerly in the direction of private money. Politicians have no incentive to cultivate the long-term health of democracy or of culture. When they stand for election in the next cycle, they need, or at least they think they need, to show tangible short-term gains in jobs and productivity. So it's not surprising that they focus on the features of higher education that I've been critical of, that seem likely to deliver just that. Imagine campaigning in this atmosphere by saying, I've laid the groundwork for the long-term health of democracy by my focus on the humanities. It's too intangible, and it wouldn't be so good a campaign slogan. Donors, by contrast, do have long-term incentives. It's about immortality and incentives to cultivate meaning and value and to stand for that and to put your name on that and to pass it on to the next generation and so on. This means that a wise university needs to guide them toward projects of genuine value and away from silly projects. And it certainly means that the universities need to stop them from telling us what to do beyond the general subject matter area. So my president says he spends more than half his time with donors saying no to things they would like to do with their money, but they do really care for the long term, often for the sort of education their grandchildren will get, and so on. Now, politicians also have to fight other cultural battles that distract them from educational values. In most state universities, the regents have to campaign for election, and sometimes they do this on extremely silly issues. In Michigan, back in 2004, the regents on the Republican side campaigned saying, I will eliminate women's studies and gay studies. So that was, it probably wasn't terribly serious, but it was a winning slogan. And so private donors are independent to some extent of the partisan political process, and if they're not, well, the university can always turn that money down. But they usually choose to devote a substantial portion of their time and money to universities because they actually like universities. And although they often have silly and sometimes obnoxious ideas, they can be reasoned with. So they're only running for immortality, as I've said. Third feature is a system of tax incentives that reward charitable donations. Fourth, long-standing social norms that give people rich reputational rewards among their peers for such donations. And, of course, under the charitable donations, I should have also added the estate tax, which means that before you get to that point, you better give a lot away. Otherwise, it just will not be yours to choose anyway. And then finally, what's most important, I think, when I look at the way that private education is being pursued in other nations, is that we have an established system of academic freedom and autonomy and faculty governance. So what donors can ask is limited, and the limits are pretty well understood, and they don't get to say which faculty are hired and which faculty are not hired, and so on. Now, of course, they're always trying to push the boundaries, but then you just push back. Elsewhere, these norms and these boundaries do not exist. So in India, it's very common for a corporation to set up something that they call a university, which is just like a training program to make profit for that corporation. There's another university, a pretty reputable one, but I don't think it's so reputable, where the chief donor is also the chancellor of the university and has control over faculty hiring. So this is all very bad, but that we don't allow that kind of thing. So in the presence of all 5 of these factors, our situation is somewhat hopeful. But constant vigilance and speaking up are urgently required if things are not to become worse. So the universities of the world have great merits, but also great and increasing problems. By contrast, I would say the abilities of citizenship are doing quite poorly in every nation in the years known as K through 12. Here, maybe more in the secondary than in the primary, the demands of the global market have made everyone focus on technical proficiency as the key thing, and the humanities and the arts and history are increasingly perceived as side issues. To the extent that they're the focus of national discussion, then all these abilities have to be tested by quantitative examinations, and the imaginative and critical abilities that lie at their core are typically left aside. In the US, national testing under the No Child Left Behind Act made things a lot worse, because at least my critical thinking ability and my imagination ability are not testable by that kind of testing at all, and the historical one wasn't included. So history teachers were being fired all over the country because that wasn't on the test. But even if you had a history test, it wouldn't be the right thing that would be tested because, as I've said, it's the critical ability to think about history that's valuable, not just parroting a list of facts. The Common Core is much better, but even that much more activity-focused test, I mean, it's certainly going in the right direction, is crude compared to what really good teaching will try to produce and often achieve. Fortunately, up until now, our colleges and universities have been the gatekeepers of school quality. They send messages of what it takes to get in and to be a good student, and they continue, up till now anyway, to look for a rich liberal education and then to build further on it. If that becomes less the case, if the governor of North Carolina has his way, then the schools will quickly become even more impoverished than they currently are. Well, what will we have if these trends continue? Nations of technically trained people who don't know how to criticize authority, useful profit makers with obtuse imaginations. I think that's pretty scary. And yet, and we see what has happened at various times in history when that has been the case. And yet, how will we avoid going down this road? Democracies have great rational and imaginative capacities. They're also prone to some serious flaws in reasoning, to parochialism, haste, sloppiness, selfishness, but even worse, deference to authority, deference to peer pressure. Education based mainly on profitability in the global market magnifies these deficiencies, producing a greedy obtuseness and a technically trained docility that threaten the very life of democracy itself and that certainly impede the creation of a decent world culture. If the real clash of civilizations is, as I believe, a clash within each individual person, as fear and narcissism contend against respect and love, all modern societies are rapidly losing that battle as they feed the forces that lead to violence and dehumanization and fail to feed the forces that lead to cultures of equality and respect. If we do not all insist on the crucial importance of the humanities and the arts, they will drop away because they don't turn a quick profit. They only do what is more precious than that: make a world that is worth living in, people who are able to see other people as full human beings with thoughts and feelings of their own that deserve respect and sympathy, and nations that are able to overcome fear and suspicion in favor of sympathetic and reasoned debate. Thank you. So I would like very much for the first 2 questions to come from students. So the microphone is going around. You have to wait till it gets to you. But please, these students whom I talked to this afternoon or the ones I talked to at dinner, I hope you will be the first ones to pose a couple of questions.
Brian Thornton, I'm a philosophy major here.
Yes, hi.
So it's interesting because you've made the point that there's a necessary condition that government should be involved within the education process. And yet you point out that politicians, because of the incentives that they're faced with themselves, are not actually the best people to implement education policies, and further, that private donors often have longer-term gains. So how is it then that when we understand that private donors tend to have better ideas, that they're willing to allow professionals, those with the best interests of hearts for things like the humanities, how is it then that we can still think that the idea of state education, specifically in the K-12 program, in that it relies on quantitative testing and things like that, lead to better outcomes?
My overall political view says that government, the buck stops there. That is, if government has to ensure that this happens, it doesn't say how government should ensure it. And there are lots of ways that government can make it possible for kids to go to college, whether the colleges themselves are private or public, by scholarships and grants, the Pell grants and so on. And in our particular situation right now, I think that approach would be better, and combined with tax advantages and so on, than the approach of having government control, because they just don't do a good job. They do a really bad job. And I think that's basically, to some extent it's true in Europe too, but the difference is that we have an alternative system of private donation that's very sophisticated, well-developed, with clear boundaries, clear standards, and Europe does not. So Europe can't just say goodbye to government, or they might get something that's a lot worse. So, in our particular context, with our particular history, I think the best way for government to do that is by making sure that no student is too poor to afford a college education. Now, K through 12 is, I think, quite different, because it is clear that our society at that level is highly stratified and highly segregated by race, by class, and that the only way that adequate education will be ensured is if government takes a hand, and it had better take a hand in redistributing within the state. I mean, even Texas has done this quite a bit, not just allowing each local district to pay for itself. So, because it's the right of every child to have an adequate pre-K, elementary, and secondary education. Now, I think it's also the right of anyone who has a particular set of aspirations and abilities to have a university education. So I do think that, but I think that's a slightly different matter, and it's probably better achieved in that other way I suggested. But I do think the survival of strong public schools is essential for the future of democracy. I think it's very worrisome that we've gone a long way down the road to the privatization, because privatization produces incredible segregation and stratification. Some private schools are different, like Dewey's Lab School, which all the children of friends of mine go to on our campus, has set aside a huge amount of money for both class and racial minorities. So Michelle Obama once said to me, because he was my colleague at the law school, she said that she would rather send Sasha and Malia to the lab school than to any school in Washington, D.C., because the private schools were segregated by class, not so much by race, but all the African Americans they weren't really African American, they were the child of some diplomat from Africa or something. And so there was much more genuine diversity at Lab than at either the public schools or the private schools in Washington, D.C. But anyway, that's rare. And much more characteristic is the situation at the school that Sasha and Malia ended up going to, Sidwell Friends, where, everyone is some sort of prosperous something, and they're, the only racial minorities are people like Sasha and Malia, who are very atypical. So, anyway, I think the local public school system, combined with an aggressive promotion of equality in schools is crucial if we're to have anything like a meaningful democracy. I think universities have done a much better job at recruiting talented minority students, recruiting and giving ample financial aid to talented poor students from poorer families. That has to get a lot better, and I think it should get a lot better, but they've done much more. Private schools, K through 12, were set up largely with the intent of screening out poor people and minorities, and they still play, unfortunately, that function. So, one more student question. Do you see any? I can't see very well here, so. Oh, here's one, yes.
Hi, Sharon Stolarz, Philosophy and English. What would you say to, it seems that even within the humanities, we're moving away from the humanities as fields like philosophy become more and more analytic and fields like aesthetics are falling out of fashion. What would you say to that?
Well, philosophy has gone through lots of cycles and fads ever since the time of Plato and Aristotle. I don't know. I mean, there's always the demand that philosophy would show that it's rigorous, and I think that's a good demand, and therefore I think it's good that logic and other forms of the study of argumentation should be central to the philosophy curriculum. What I don't like is the turn to nothing but laboratory experimentation, the kind of pseudoscience, a substitution of looking at MRIs of the brain for real thought about ethics. Now, I mean, fine, let's learn all we can, but unfortunately there is this obsession with measurable data, and usually what you can measure by looking at an MRI of the brain is much cruder than what Kant and Hume and so on have actually gotten out of their own minds and imaginations, and so philosophy itself becomes more crude. That same thing happened in the 1970s when, well, a little later, I guess the late 70s, when I was just finishing graduate school. At Stanford, they had this Center for the Study of Language and Information. It had a lot of money. All the philosophers rushed to that to get grants for computer modeling of this and that, computer modeling of common sense. And then that fad kind of withered, and it turned out not to generate anything very interesting. So I think that philosophy is just, it is subject to these fads. And certainly, given the decline in a lot of people's reading habits and reading abilities, a department like ours that emphasizes strongly the history of philosophy and the reading of complicated books has got to, struggle against the tide. But I don't think things are in such a bad way. I actually think if you think about journals like Ethics, I don't know if you ever look at that journal, but since that's my area, it's the one journal I've been an associate editor of, I think the articles that are coming out in Ethics, they don't show the problem you say. They might be a little bit badly written, but philosophers have never been known for their fine writing. I mean, there are exceptions to that, like Rousseau and Hume and so on. But I mean, certainly, there are great philosophers like Kant, who was a terrible writer, and Hegel also, I think. So, articles in ethics are pretty good, I think. And the field is in not such a bad state. I think with John Rawls, there was a tremendous revival of genuine normative, ethical, and political thought. And he insisted on that. He never taught anything but historical texts. He never taught his own work. He only taught the great, Aristotle, Hume, Kant, and so on. And also, he encouraged his students to work on real normative issues and on historical texts. So I think that it broke the tyranny of logical positivism, which had been around for about 15 years before that, and then it opened up everything, and we could talk about values again. And then we became able to talk about applied ethics and medical ethics. I remember when Cicely Bach first wrote the first dissertation on applied ethics at Harvard on euthanasia, and that was regarded as absolutely scandalous and low level. And of course, only a woman would do such a low thing. But actually, that's burgeoning now, and it's affected the way decisions are made in every hospital. What I myself have been associated with, talking about the emotions, talking about love and friendship. Now, of course, that was always a big part of Plato and Aristotle, so coming out of that, I mean, it wasn't so surprising that I did that. But at the same time, there was this kind of resistance. And again, it was gendered. People would say, oh, well, women would always talk about love and so on. But there were, I had Bernard Williams to kind of run interference for me in a way. And so there were very courageous and innovative men like Rawls and Williams who had broken the field open and let space exist for these other ways of doing things. And I think that hasn't changed. So you wouldn't want to be back in the 1960s or 50s at all. It's much better now.
As I listen to the Republican and Democratic debates and the discussions and the interviews of voters, I'm wondering what happened to critical thinking and education.
Well, look, I mean, I'm not going to do this I do have a view of my own, but I think there is a difference between the two parties. And it's unmistakable. That is, the Democratic debates have shown mutual respect, engagement with argument, concern for fact. I don't think that all the facts are, I think some of the economics that's pervade is not accurate and so on, but okay, there's a basic level of common decency and thoughtfulness and respect. The Republican side, it's just, you can't draw the line between mass entertainment and political discussion. That's what's so distressing. And, there are candidates that have tried to rise above that, like Kasich. He's still in the campaign, but no one pays attention to him because he's actually talking about facts. And he actually has been quite determined to point to the facts of how Medicare affects people in his state and so forth. But unfortunately, the whole thing has been kind of swept up in this frenzy of, media showcasing, circus almost. And I think that has partly been caused by the media themselves. It's perfectly clear that Roger Ailes, for example, is very interested in boosting ratings. And that Donald Trump's presence in the campaign, and of course his increasing success, has vastly boosted ratings for Fox and so on. So, I think that whole thing is very unsettling. I guess one can take comfort from the fact that America has gone through phases of this kind of populism before, like William Jennings Bryan. William Jennings Bryan seems to me, at the great distance from which I look at him, a more endearing figure by far than Trump, but maybe he wasn't. Probably not. After all, he did doggedly oppose the teaching of evolution in the schools, and he testified at the Scopes trial in Tennessee and so on. He actually believed and asserted in the Scopes trial that the world was created in the year 4004 BC, and so he totally rejected all scientific geological evidence. So the assault on basic science went a bit further than it does in today's Republican Party, maybe only a bit, but certainly further. So maybe if we survived that, we can survive this.
Thank you for your remarks, very interesting. There's been an extraordinary increase in the cost of higher education over the last 25, 30 years, or at least since I went to college. Do you feel that there's a correlation between that rapid rise in the cost of education and the decline of interest in subjects, the humanities, that don't produce an immediate economic benefit?
I don't know. It's a tough question because a large part of the reason for the escalation in the costs is the cost of doing scientific research. And of course, there are grants coming in, but that doesn't pay for everything, as you know, and doesn't pay for buildings and equipment and so on. And so you might think that the humanities, which are so inexpensive, all we need is time and bodies and basic classrooms and so on, that should have made us favored in this climate of scarcity. And so why hasn't that happened? Well, I guess once you invest, you sink so much money into a hospital, you've got to make those people happy, and you've got to figure out how that can be a non-loss part of your institution. So I find in my own institution, it's partly that the hospital has assumed enormous power over decision-making in the university simply because so large a part of the university's finances are sunk in it. So if it goes bad or loses the best people, and so, then a lot of money is lost. Whereas if all the humanists departed, the bottom line would not be that much affected. So it's almost because we cost so little that people don't care about us. I can't quite figure it out. So, but I think it's complicated and it's not simple. And the costs that have gone up, it's certainly not because of the humanities that they've gone up, nor because of the social sciences. Our research it's true, it doesn't bring in big grant money, but it doesn't cost very much. You just have to give us sabbaticals, and then we go and write our books, and we need a travel budget or something like that. And it's true of law schools, too. Now, legal education has a special feature, which has made it get somehow a greater need for money recently, which is that they never used to give any scholarship aid at all, because they assumed that every graduate would, on graduating, have a job, and they would not only have a job, but they'd probably be immediately earning more than the faculty. I mean, like starting salary at big firms can be up to $200,000. So as long as that golden egg was there, they didn't have to worry about scholarship aid. Then they started worrying about, well, but what if people wanted to be public defenders or go into pro bono work of various kinds? So they started giving loan forgiveness to people who went into public service, but still note, no outright merit or need-based scholarship aid. And now we're way behind the undergraduate institutions, way, way behind, and no one knows quite what to do about it. Of course, there is money being raised for scholarship aid, and sometimes it's need-based and sometimes it's merit-based. But the problem is it's way behind where other institutions are. So there are other proposals that are very pernicious that are coming in about how to economize, namely, cut out the third year of law school and have people take the bar after 2 years, which means cutting out all the stuff that I do. Courses about social justice, courses that enrich and humanize the legal education. And fortunately, that's not going to take hold in our law school, I'm very glad to say, and not only because we have a strong tradition of that, but also because you have to be very vigilant, and I volunteered to spend a good part of my summer on the Dean Search Committee for the law school to make sure that whoever was chosen would be a friend of the humanities. And at the interview, I say things like, what novels have you read recently, and so on. And I got somebody who PhD in economics, but a very strong friend of the humanities, and even interested in writing a paper about Dickens for our next conference volume. So anyway, that's the kind of, you have to watch everything. And it's not so much the case, I think, with the rest of the humanities where there's a kind of steady state. I mean, there are financial problems, but there's no sudden discovery that, well, we have to pay people scholarship aid, because they knew that long, long ago. So the change is more gradual, it's more connected with the financial crisis, but also with all kinds of complicated issues about the economics of hospitals and healthcare that I don't fully understand.
Thank you, Professor. The question I want to ask you, one of your former colleagues, a tremendous television program called Justice, The Right Thing to Do with Michael Sandel. They were lined up.
He's not a former colleague of mine, by the way.
Weren't you at Harvard when he was there?
I was at Harvard, but I was in the philosophy department and the classics department, and he's always been in the political science department. No, I mean, I know
But he
Michael,
uses
I just
the
wanted to
Socratic
correct
method to its nth
Yeah,
degree.
yeah.
And they were lined up in China 2 days ahead of
Yeah,
time
yeah,
to
yeah.
hear him talk. So why do we not have more media involvement in that type of education?
Well, look, I think media are second best. That is, it's always much more effective, and I think this is proven again and again, to have live face-to-face interactions and to have people grading your work who really know you. Now, of course, Sandel doesn't grade all the work in that huge class, but I taught a class of 500 people at Harvard too, and I graded one section, and then I had a lot of other section people grading the other section, and they were all graduate students in philosophy, and we met for several hours every week to talk about the students and their work, and I'm sure that Sandel does that too. So it's a lot of work, but that kind of personalized teaching is much more impactful, it is much better teaching, it's much more meaningful to the students than teaching where there's this great distance. Now, of course, if you're in a remote spot and you can't, and you're working, distance education online has a real role to play. The Open University in Britain has long been educating people who are working people who can't have time to go to university, and I think online learning is another version of that, actually. But we all know that it's the second best, and maybe some developing countries will do well from that, but I'm skeptical simply because I think we have to ask ourselves the question of what is the ethical responsibility of a rich American university toward developing countries. Now, some universities, and I mean, I think his thing is not done through Harvard. I'm not sure how it's funded, but I would single out NYU and Yale in particular, have gone, I would say, have taken the low road of setting up cash-generating programs in developing countries without sufficiently taking thought for educational quality, the enrichment of indigenous faculty, and so on. Now, our university has taken what I would call the high road, and that is we have centers in both Beijing and Delhi. We're going to open one in Latin America before long. But they're collaborative centers for faculty research. Their design is not to make money. We don't offer courses, we don't take tuition money, but to give money by funding collaborative research projects from medicine to film study involving both U of Chicago faculty and faculty from India. So this project on prejudice and stigma that I mentioned briefly is funded by our center in Delhi, and we got a grant to have conference and a book and so on. So that's the kind of thing we do, and I think it's much more respectful of the other countries. Say, look, you have scholars, but your scholars, unfortunately, have a shortage of sources of funding for things like conferences and publications, so we're going to help you do stuff that you want to do, but besides, we have fun talking to you, and we like learning from you, so we're going to join with you in that. And I think that shows respect for the other country, and I think the other thing where we set up courses with the Harvard label or the NYU label and just take people's money does not show respect, really, for the other countries. So it's a complicated issue, but that's my view.
Well, how about another round of applause for Dr. Nussbaum?
Thank you.
Thank you so much for coming. Appreciate it.